What is happening to America when none of this is happening alone?
It's another frigid day for millions as we brace for another snowstorm here on the East Coast.
Cars nearby are encased in ice after a pipe reportedly burst.
The CHP tells us it was all caused by a familiar danger for anyone who's made that drive north through the Central Valley. Dense fog made for very low visibility.
Winter no longer brings silence. It brings thick fog across California, reducing highway visibility to near zero and triggering consequences that follow as a matter of course. And it seemed to mark the moment when everything that had felt normal suddenly no longer did. Rivers surged past their limits without warning. Solid ground caved in, swallowing roads and homes as if they were never there. And above it all, the sky shifted. Unnatural sounds, deep trumpet-like roll through the air, stopping people cold. What was happening was easy to see, but far harder for anyone to truly understand why. The Bible speaks to this kind of moment. There are times described when people see, yet do not fully perceive, when events unfold plainly before them, but understanding lags behind experience. The question now is not what everyone noticed, but why now? Why didn't it raise concern at first? If you're trying to understand what's unfolding, like and subscribe before we break down each event in detail. Across parts of California, a different kind of unease spread quietly this winter. It didn't arrive with sirens or storms. Instead, a video spreading rapidly overnight showed California's Central Valley nearly disappearing beneath a dense winter fog. On Highway 99, familiar stretches of road faded from view in minutes. Headlights dissolved into glare. Taillights vanished without warning. What drivers relied on for distance and direction simply ceased to exist. It left many people uneasy when they realized how suddenly normal movement had stopped. Highway 99 is one of California's most critical transportation corridors, carrying commuters, freight, and emergency vehicles every single day. When the fog settled in, traffic slowed to a crawl almost instantly. In some areas, it stopped altogether. By early morning, the region was wrapped in a heavy, silent whiteout. Visibility dropped to near zero, for miles at a time. Drivers were forced to abandon vehicles along shoulders. Emergency responders moved cautiously, guided more by sound than sight. Pileups were reported as cars entered the fog, unaware of what lay ahead. Hundreds of vehicles became trapped in place. Road travel was severely disrupted, and reports confirmed serious accidents caused by the sudden loss of visibility. Dozens of cars and trucks were involved in the accident, forcing Freeway 99 closed and causing major traffic disruption. These were not just delays or inconveniences. Lives were affected. Families waited for news. Anxiety spread through communities that depend on this highway every day. Weather experts described the event as a classic winter fog episode, intensified by cold air trapped beneath warmer layers above. They noted that changing climate patterns are increasing the frequency and severity of these conditions, overwhelming road systems designed for clearer winters. Yet, as footage showed long stretches of highway swallowed by whiteness, many were reminded of ancient warnings found in Scripture. In the book of Isaiah, there is a description of a people moving forward while unable to see their path. We grope along the wall like the blind. We stumble at noon, as if it were twilight. The image is not about nightfall, but about daylight without clarity, motion without vision. Winter is meant to bring stillness and definition, yet here it brought blindness instead. The prophets often describe such moments not as punishment, but as testing times, when familiar ways disappear, forcing people to slow down and question direction rather than rush ahead out of habit. As fog continued to cling to the highway and daylight failed to clear it, one question lingered beneath the surface. Is this an isolated incident, or the beginning of something far more unsettling? Winter has not loosened its grip, and new signs continue to surface through sinkholes and landslides. In several areas that appeared calm and untouched by the worst of the season, residents began to relax. There were no blizzards, no howling winds, no frozen highways, no scenes of chaos. Daily life seemed normal. Many believed the danger had passed. It was within that calm that disaster arrived quietly and without warning. There was no explosion, no alarm, no visible signal of threat. The ground itself, long trusted as solid, dependable, and permanent, suddenly collapsed beneath them. In moments, familiar streets vanished. Houses were pulled downward. Cars slipped into darkness, as if they had never existed. Massive sinkholes opened without notice, carving deep scars into the earth. Beneath them was a vast emptiness, dark, unstable, and impossible to fully comprehend. People gathered at a distance, stunned into silence, trying to grasp that only minutes earlier the same place had been a home, a road, a path to safety. What made these events so disturbing was not only the destruction, but the total absence of warning. Unlike storms or earthquakes, which often give signs, sinkholes strike suddenly and without mercy. They stand as a stark reminder that humanity does not truly control the ground beneath its feet. At the same time, coastal regions have experienced landslides with increasing force. Cliffs, slowly worn by the ocean for decades, suddenly gave way. Large sections of land dropped into the sea, carrying trees, buildings, and history with them. Specialists point to heavy rain, shifting climate patterns, and weakened rock layers below the surface. From a scientific perspective, these explanations are reasonable. Yet for many people of faith, a deeper question remains. Why are these events happening so often, so abruptly, and so close together in time? Scripture has long warned that in the final days, even what seems secure will be shaken. Isaiah 24 speaks of the foundations of the earth being disturbed. Psalm 18 describes the earth quaking and the mountains trembling. Today's sinkholes and landslides cause many to recall these ancient words, not to incite fear, but to awaken awareness. They point to a truth often overlooked. Lasting security does not come from buildings, possessions, or human systems, but from a firm foundation in God. When the ground beneath us can disappear without warning, we are forced to examine where our confidence truly lies, whether in wealth, stability, and control, or in the Creator, who alone cannot be shaken. These events serve as a call to humility, vigilance, and spiritual readiness, not only to prepare our homes and communities, but to prepare our inner lives. For if even the earth can fail, then God alone remains a refuge. Before we continue, let us pause for a brief prayer. May God grant us clarity, wisdom, and calm hearts as we reflect on what we are witnessing. As the afternoon faded into evening, an unusual sound rolled through the air across parts of the United States. It was not sharp, not explosive, but deep, prolonged, and resonant, echoing like a low trumpet carried on the wind. The sky itself seemed to vibrate as the sound passed overhead, lingering longer than thunder and lacking any clear direction. At first, people paused, unsure how to describe what they were hearing. It did not resemble aircraft. It did not follow the rhythm of machinery. The sound rose, fell, then returned again, slow, heavy, and unmistakably present. Windows rattled faintly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were lifted, not to record, but to check whether anyone else was hearing the same thing. Then came the reaction. Birds that had been resting on power lines and rooftops suddenly lifted into the air. Their flight was uneven and erratic, breaking formation as they scattered across the sky. They circled briefly, then disappeared, leaving the space above strangely empty. The animals seemed to respond not to sight, but to something felt rather than seen. The sound did not fade quickly. It lingered, pulsing through the atmosphere, as if moving through layers of air rather than across the ground. Some described it as coming from everywhere at once. Others said it felt closer to vibration than noise. Online, explanations began to circulate. Some pointed to military activity or distant aircraft. Others mentioned atmospheric conditions or rare acoustic effects. Yet none of these explanations fully matched the timing, depth, or persistence of what people heard. And many asked the same quiet question: why did it happen here, and why now? In moments like this, science can explain parts of what we observe, but not always the way it feels. That gap between explanation and experience is where unease grows. In Scripture, sound carried through the air is often described as a signal rather than an accident. Trumpet-like sounds are not portrayed as background noise, but as calls to attention moments meant to interrupt routine and awaken awareness. The meaning is not fear, but recognition. Ezekiel continues that thought. The fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. When the sound finally faded, it left behind more than silence. It left a sense that something had passed through, unseen, unfixed, and unanswered. And the question that lingered was not whether the sound could be explained, but whether it was meant to be noticed at all. As the sky began to shift, people lifted their eyes in fear. Attention slowly shifted northward, toward waters long considered distant and untouched. What followed was quieter than floods or collapsing ground, but no less unsettling. Along remote stretches of Alaska's coastline, dark, oil-like material began appearing on icy shores, thick, tarry, unmistakably black against snow and frozen rock. There were no tankers in distress, no drilling platforms nearby, no industrial accidents reported. Authorities confirmed there were no modern oil spills to explain what was surfacing. At first, the material appeared in small patches, scattered and easily overlooked. But as reports increased, the pattern became harder to ignore. The substance was not spreading from a single source. It was emerging at multiple points along the coast, as if pushed upward rather than spilled outward. Scientists examining the phenomenon emphasized one critical detail. This was not new material. It had not been recently produced or released by human activity. Instead, evidence pointed downward. Beneath Alaska's coastal waters lie vast layers of ancient organic matter, buried deep beneath sediment, rock, and frozen ground. Some of these deposits date back thousands of years, sealed under pressure since long before modern history. Researchers believe shifts beneath the seafloor caused by changing pressure, thawing permafrost, and subtle ground movement have fractured those ancient layers. What had remained locked away for centuries was now being forced to the surface. This was not creation, it was exposure. What made the discovery especially troubling was its timing. It did not arrive in isolation. It followed reports of ground instability, collapsing foundations, and changing conditions elsewhere. The land was not simply reacting at the surface. It appeared to be releasing what it had long contained. For many observers, the question was not whether the substance posed immediate danger, but what it represented. Ancient, sealed matter does not surface without cause. Pressure builds quietly over time. Release comes only when restraint fails. Scripture often describes such moments not as accidents, but as unveilings. In the book of Job, it is written, He uncovers the deeps out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light. The emphasis is not on destruction, but revelation. What was hidden does not remain hidden forever. The appearance of oil-like residue along Alaska's frozen coast has led many to ask a deeper question, one that science alone does not answer. Why now? Why are substances buried, since ancient times, emerging at this moment, alongside so many other signs of instability? When the Earth begins to give up what it has long held, it forces a reckoning, not only with the land beneath our feet, but with the assumption that what is sealed will always remain so. The concern is not only what has surfaced, but what else may still be waiting below. For the moment, restraint finally gives way. As attention remained fixed on what was rising along distant coastlines, another discovery was unfolding quietly beneath Florida, hidden not by water or ice, but by the ground itself. For decades, maps and surveys suggested that the underground cave systems beneath the state were limited, fragmented, and well understood. That assumption is now collapsing. Beneath neighborhoods, roads, and protected land, vast empty chambers have been discovered, spaces far larger and deeper than anything previously recorded. What makes these caverns unsettling is not only their size, but how long they remained unseen. They were not uncovered by advanced scanning. They were not revealed by exploration or drilling. They came to light only when the ground above them could no longer hold. In several areas, the surface failed without warning. Streets cracked, land sank, and as it did, openings appeared, exposing hollow worlds beneath. These chambers were not newly formed. Geological analysis confirms they have existed for thousands of years, slowly carved by water moving through limestone, sealed beneath layers of earth, while life continued above, unaware. This was not a discovery made by human effort. It was exposure, forced by collapse. What lies beneath Florida has always been there, quietly bearing weight, supporting cities, highways, and generations of development. Over time, erosion and shifting pressure weakened the ceilings of these hidden spaces. When balance finally gave way, the underground was revealed not because it was sought, but because concealment failed. What troubles experts is not simply that these caves exist, but how extensive they are. Old maps no longer apply. Known boundaries no longer hold. The ground beneath what appeared stable is far more fragile and far more complex than once believed. The land did not announce this change. It revealed it only when failure made silence impossible. For many people of faith, this pattern feels familiar. Scripture repeatedly teaches that what is hidden does not remain hidden forever. In the book of Daniel, it is written, "He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness." The emphasis is not on human discovery, but on revelation, truths emerging when the time arrives. Job echoes this theme, stating that the earth itself gives up what it has long concealed. The message is consistent. Concealment is temporary. Exposure comes when pressure reaches its limit. What is happening beneath Florida is more than a geological adjustment. It is a reminder. Entire worlds can exist below the surface, unseen, until the moment they are forced into view. When the ground itself begins to uncover what it once protected, the question shifts from what was hidden to why it is being revealed now. And if structures buried for thousands of years are emerging only because the surface can no longer contain them, it leaves one thought difficult to ignore: how much more lies beneath, waiting for the moment when concealment is no longer possible. As attention shifted from what was being exposed beneath the surface in Florida, another phenomenon began to emerge farther inland. One that unsettled witnesses not because of violence, but because of restraint. In Colorado, reports did not describe collapse, rupture, or destruction. There was no violent shaking, No cracking ground. No landslides or sudden failure. What witnesses observed was far quieter and far more difficult to explain. Across different locations and elevations, individuals reported the ground rising and settling in a slow, even rhythm. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The motion was gentle, measured, and consistent, as if the land itself were adjusting. Those who stood on it said it did not feel chaotic, it felt deliberate. Many struggled to find words. Again and again, the same description appeared. It was like breathing. The ground did not break apart, it did not give way beneath weight. Instead, it lifted slightly, then released. Over and over, steady enough to be felt, subtle enough to escape immediate alarm. What made the reports difficult to dismiss was their consistency. Witnesses, unfamiliar with one another, standing miles apart, described the same sensation with the same language. Equally unsettling was what did not accompany the movement. There were no earthquakes recorded, no seismic alerts, no volcanic activity. Instruments that typically explain motion at that scale showed nothing abnormal. Geologists suggested possibilities: pressure redistribution, groundwater shifts, slow crustal adjustment, but even they acknowledged the irregularity. The movement was too smooth, too synchronized, too controlled. In Scripture, mountains are often portrayed as symbols of permanence, what humans assume will never move. Yet the Bible also records moments when mountains respond, not with collapse, but with reaction. The prophet Nahum writes that the mountains tremble before him, and the hills melt. The language is not of destruction, but of response creation, reacting to a greater presence. The Psalms echo this imagery, describing hills moving not in chaos, but in awareness. The emphasis is not on breaking apart, but on motion with purpose. Even Habakkuk speaks of God standing, measuring the earth, and only then do the mountains move. Measurement precedes change. What people are witnessing in Colorado does not resemble disaster. It resembles preparation, not an ending, but an adjustment. Not a collapse, but a loosening. Not violence, but readiness. When even the most stable parts of the landscape refuse to remain completely still, it challenges a deep assumption that everything beneath us is settled, fixed, and finished. If mountains long regarded as immovable can shift quietly without warning, Scripture suggests this is not random. It is a signal, and it leaves behind a question that grows harder to ignore. What kind of season are we living in, when the land itself appears to be preparing for something yet to come? Near Cedar Creek Lake in East Texas, an unusual sight, quietly unsettled residents. Behind rows of lakeside homes, a narrow tornado formed without warning, thin as a cord, rising straight from the ground into low-hanging clouds. It looked less like a violent funnel, and more like a line drawn upward, as if linking Earth to the sky above. What made people stop and stare was not its speed, but its behavior. The tornado moved slowly, almost deliberately. This region is no stranger to severe weather, yet many who watched felt immediately that this was different. Something about its shape and motion did not match what they had seen before. It appeared fragile, almost delicate, yet deeply unsettling. A slender column turning quietly against the calm suburban sky, creating a contrast that was hard to ignore. Despite its narrow form, the damage it left behind was undeniable. Large trees were torn from the ground. Roofs were peeled back. Several homes suffered significant damage, consistent with a lower-end tornado. The destruction was limited in scope, but strong enough to leave an impression that lingered longer than the storm itself. Meteorologists were quick to respond. They explained that the tornado formed from unstable atmospheric conditions, contrasting temperatures and pressure systems, generating rotation. By classification, it was not extraordinary. Yet the length, thin structure, and slow movement continued to trouble those who witnessed it firsthand. As questions spread, some turned to older texts, not for explanation, but for perspective. In the book of Job, storms are described as forces that move with intention beyond human control. He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. Job 37. The passage does not frame storms as random accidents, but as reminders of how limited human understanding truly is. The prophet Jeremiah also speaks of a time when the natural order feels unsettled, when signs appear not to terrify, but to awaken awareness. And in Amos, the shaking of land and sky is portrayed as a moment meant to interrupt complacency, not simply to destroy. From that perspective, the tornado at Cedar Creek Lake becomes more than a weather event. It becomes a moment that unsettles routine, a reminder that what feels stable can be disturbed quietly, suddenly, and without announcement. When the thin funnel finally unraveled and disappeared back into the clouds, the sky returned to its calm appearance. But the feeling it left behind did not fade as quickly. If such moments are not meant to signal chaos, then perhaps they exist to prompt reflection. Not about fear, but about readiness. Not about panic, but about attention. And the question that lingered was not what caused the tornado, but what it was calling people to notice before the skies grow quiet again. The morning at Yellowstone did not begin with fire in the sky, but with movement beneath the ground. Steam vents intensified without warning. Geysers that normally followed predictable intervals began erupting out of sequence. Plumes of hot water and vapor shot higher than usual, hanging in the cold air like signals rather than scenery. The shift was sudden. What had been a calm landscape of snow-dusted ground and quiet boardwalks transformed into an area charged with tension. The earth trembled lightly, not enough to cause panic, but enough to be felt. Pools near thermal basins churned more violently, their colors darkening as heat surged upward. Ash did not fall here, but the air itself changed. Sulfurous steam drifted across nearby roads and trails, reducing visibility and forcing closures within the park. Rangers moved quickly to clear visitors from sensitive zones as activity spread across multiple geothermal sites at once. The sense of scale grew rapidly. This was not a single vent reacting, but a system responding together. A normal morning gave way to urgent decisions. Access points were shut down. Safety warnings were issued. Scientists monitored pressure changes beneath the caldera, watching for signs of escalating instability. Instruments recorded increased heat flow and subtle ground deformation signals that something deeper was shifting. Geologists explained the mechanics. Rising magma pressure, combined with tectonic stress, can force heat and gases upward through Yellowstone's vast underground network. Such activity does not always lead to eruption, but it carries long-term risks. Ground collapse, toxic gas release, and irreversible damage to surrounding ecosystems and communities. In moments like this, ancient words often return not as explanations, but as perspective. In the book of Isaiah, the earth is described as reacting when its foundations are disturbed. The earth trembles and shakes. It staggers like a hut. Isaiah 24. The passage is not focused on spectacle, but on instability, on what happens when what seemed immovable begins to shift. The book of Job speaks even more directly to forces beneath the surface, describing fire and heat hidden within the earth, beyond human reach or control. These texts frame such moments not as chaos, but as reminders of limits of how little command humanity truly has over the ground it stands upon. From that perspective, Yellowstone is not merely a park or a destination. It is a reminder of restrained power of forces held in balance, not by human design, but by conditions that can change. As steam continued to rise and the ground slowly settled, one question lingered in the quiet that followed. When the earth itself shows signs of unrest, do we treat it as background noise or as a moment calling for attention before something far greater is released? Jesus had warned that a time would come when the world would feel unfamiliar, not because it had ended, but because its order had begun to strain. His words were not framed as fear-driven predictions, but as signs meant to be recognized. In the Gospels, Jesus speaks of days when the earth and sky would no longer behave as expected, when creation itself would respond in ways that disrupt routine and certainty. He warned that there would be signs in the heavens and distress among nations, not isolated events, but pressures arriving together. The warning was not about curiosity or spectacle. It was about awareness. Jesus described moments when people would carry on with ordinary life, unaware that deeper forces were moving beneath the surface. The danger, he said, was not the signs themselves, but the blindness that causes people to ignore them. Throughout Scripture, disruption is often used as a form of revelation. When boundaries fail and foundations shift, it exposes where trust has been misplaced. Jesus echoed this theme when he spoke of houses built on sand and rock. The storm does not create weakness, it reveals it. When the storm comes, only what is firmly grounded remains standing. Jesus also warned that these signs would not come with clarity or comfort. He said, confusion would spread, hearts would grow heavy, and fear would rise because the familiar rhythms of life would no longer hold. Yet he did not speak these words to terrify. He spoke them to prepare. He told his followers to watch, not panic, to discern, not dismiss. In the book of Luke, Jesus makes it clear that the signs are not random. They are signals. When creation reacts, it is not acting independently, but responding within limits set by God. Scripture consistently shows that the natural world reflects spiritual realities. When restraint weakens in one, it echoes in the other. Revelation expands on this warning through imagery of trumpets and shaking foundations. These are not symbols of entertainment or myth. They represent moments when God interrupts human self-assurance. The trumpet in Scripture is a call to attention, a line drawn between indifference and response. It demands awareness before judgment, reflection before consequence. Jesus warned that many would see these signs and still continue as before. Life would go on, commerce would continue, distractions would multiply. And yet, he said, those who understand would recognize the season, not the date, but the meaning, not the hour, but the direction. The central message of Jesus' warning is not destruction, but decision. Signs are not given to predict timelines, but to expose hearts. They ask where confidence truly rests. In systems, in stability, or in God alone. Jesus ended his warning with a call to posture, not fear. When these things begin to happen, he said, lift your heads. Not because the world is ending, but because accountability and redemption are drawing near. The warning remains now, pressing every generation to choose attentiveness over denial. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think.
This morning, a state of emergency across California as massive amounts of rain drench the West.
They're going somewhere.
2 minutes ago, something shifted beneath the United States. In normally stable regions, The ground is splitting and cutting through farmland with no storms, no earthquakes, or warning. Above it, flocks of birds suddenly turn back mid-flight, moving in perfect unison as if responding to something unseen. Then the earth itself begins to fail. Sinkholes open beneath Pennsylvania neighborhoods where families had felt secure for decades, forcing them to evacuate without tremors or warning. Now even the rivers are changing white foam, stretching for miles as fish rise silently. These events are not isolated. They are arriving together. And the question is no longer if something is unfolding, but why it is happening now. If you're willing to look beyond the surface and connect what others overlook, like, subscribe, and stay with us. In recent weeks, unusual changes have been reported along parts of the California. Residents began noticing long, straight cracks appearing across hardened ground, clean lines cutting through open land. These cracks were not jagged or chaotic. They appeared as clean lines, running parallel for hundreds of meters, dividing fields and empty lots with unsettling precision. What made these fissures disturbing was not just where they appeared, but their timing. They did not follow known fault lines. There were no earthquakes recorded overnight, no storms, no flooding. In several cases, tire tracks and footprints from the previous day ended abruptly at the edge of a new crack, as if the land had shifted quietly while everything else slept. Unlike drought-related cracks that branch and curl as moisture evaporates unevenly, these lines advanced forward, straight and deliberate. Local officials and geologists offered familiar explanations: long-term groundwater depletion, subsidence, gradual pressure building beneath the surface. The processes were known. The language was technical, yet the timing remained difficult to account for. Similar cracks are appearing across regions with different soil compositions and climates. People living near these areas described a shared response. There was no panic, no crowds. Often, it was just one or two individuals stopping their cars, stepping out, and standing silently for several minutes. The ground did not look violently damaged. It looked altered, separated, as if something below had shifted without warning or sound. Scripture often uses this image when speaking of warning and exposure. Collapse rarely begins with noise. Foundations weaken first. They separate before they fall. The prophet Isaiah warned of a land breaking apart quietly, writing, "The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken." Yet before the violent shaking comes separation, what appears firm begins to give way beneath the surface. That is why these fractures feel different from ordinary geological events. They are not disasters. They have not destroyed homes or taken lives. Instead, they reveal change. They show that something once whole is no longer unified. The question, then, is not whether the ground can crack. That has always happened. The deeper question is why this kind of precise separation is appearing now quietly, across multiple regions, without a dramatic trigger, and whether the division visible in the land reflects an instability that has already begun beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. As the ground below continued to separate in silence, another disturbance appeared overhead. Along parts of the Los Angeles and into western San Francisco, people began reporting flocks of birds abruptly changing direction mid-flight. The shift was sudden, nearly a full reversal, and it happened in unison. The birds did not scatter or cry out. They stayed tightly grouped, turning together as if responding to something ahead that could not be seen. There were no storm systems developing offshore. The sky was pale and open, broken only by thin streaks of cloud. Commercial flights moved steadily across the horizon. Nothing visible explained why entire flocks would abandon their course at the same instant. People watching from the grounds described a quiet discomfort, not fear, but a sense that something was off. The sky looked ordinary, yet the movement within it was not. The moment felt linked to what had already been unfolding below. The land had not broken apart with force. It had separated quietly, almost carefully. Now, the birds did not flee in confusion. They simply turned away. Yet the change was unmistakable. In the Bible, animals are often shown responding before humans understand what is coming. In the Old Testament, the prophet Jeremiah observed that even animals recognize approaching change sooner than people do. Even the stork in the heavens knows her appointed times, and the turtle-dove swallow and crane keep the time of their coming. But my people know not the judgment of the Lord. Jeremiah 8-7. Instinct, Scripture suggests, can perceive shifts that reason ignores. In the days of Noah, Scripture says the animals entered the ark on their own. Noah did not drive them in. They arrived when the time was right. Creation moved first, before judgment was fully revealed. This pattern appears more than once in Scripture. Nature senses change before people recognize danger. Job speaks of this same awareness embedded within creation itself. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you. Job 12-7. That is what makes these sightings difficult to dismiss. Birds do not waste energy without cause. They follow instinct shaped over countless generations. When that instinct overrides direction and destination under calm conditions, it suggests awareness beyond human perception. The question is not whether birds can behave strangely. The deeper question is why these reversals are happening now, across multiple states, beneath quiet skies. What did the birds sense in the air, or beyond it, that people could not detect? And if creation is responding early, what does that suggest about what may still be approaching, unseen, but already in motion? As the land continued to show signs of separation, another disturbance followed, this time directly beneath where people lived. In central Pennsylvania, a massive sinkhole opened inside a quiet residential neighborhood. The collapse began without warning. Within minutes, the earth opened and widened rapidly, swallowing yards and pulling pavement inward. There were no hurricanes passing through, no heavy rain, no seismic alerts. Yet the ground failed beneath homes where families had lived for generations. Residents described standing at a distance, hearing the low, muffled sound. Sidewalks split, driveways tilted, walls cracked and leaned before slipping out of sight. There was no explosion, no violent jolt, only the slow, irreversible understanding that the ground could no longer support what had been placed upon it. At nearly the same time, similar changes were unfolding in southern Utah and parts of Nevada. Slopes did not collapse in dramatic landslides. Instead, the land began to settle unevenly. Entire sections of ground descended inch by inch, damaging homes, water lines, and power infrastructure. Families were asked to leave quietly, often after dark, carrying only essential belongings, without clear explanations or visible triggers. What made these events especially unsettling was where they occurred. Several collapses appeared near mapped fault zones, yet seismic instruments recorded no earthquakes. Witnesses described the feeling as movement without impact, as if the ground had given up silently beneath them. Not a quake, not a tremor, but a quiet displacement. In Scripture, the earth is not portrayed as inert when judgment or warning approaches. The book of Numbers records a moment when the ground opened without storm or shaking. The ground under them split apart. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them. Numbers 16:31-32. There was no battle, no thunder, only sudden separation beneath those standing above it. The psalmist later describes collapse not as noise, but as loss of support. When the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Psalm 11:3. The verse assumes that the failure begins below. Likewise, Isaiah speaks of land giving way under accumulated weight. The earth staggers like a drunkard, for its transgression lies heavy upon it. Isaiah 24:20. The burden builds quietly until the ground can no longer hold. Even Job frames this awareness as something creation itself understands. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. Job 9-6. The pillars do not always fall at once. They loosen first. That is why these events feel different. They are not sudden disasters. They are exposures. The land is not crying out. It is yielding quietly, as if responding to a pressure long ignored. The question is no longer why the ground can collapse. Nature has always done that. The deeper question is why it is happening now, across multiple states, without warning and without sound, and whether this silent shifting beneath our feet is pointing to something else that has already begun to give way, unseen, below the surface. After the land began to split, and the ground gave way without sound, another quiet shift followed, this time in the water. Along portions of the Ohio River Valley, the upper Mississippi Basin, and stretches of the Missouri River, residents began noticing changes that did not fit familiar seasonal patterns. Rivers that had flowed steadily for decades began to look unsettled without appearing violent. Thick bands of white foam collected along the surface, clinging to bends and shorelines, stretching uninterrupted for miles. There were no nearby factories releasing visible waste, no upstream flooding reported, no sharp chemical odor rising from the water. The air smelled ordinary. The current moved at its usual pace, yet the rivers no longer looked clean. The foam lingered dense, chalky, slow to break apart, drifting downstream, but refusing to dissolve the way surface froth normally does. Water samples were taken. Routine explanations followed. Runoff, organic matter, turbulence. None fully accounted for the scale or persistence of what people were seeing. What should have dispersed within hours remained for days. What should have passed unnoticed began drawing quiet crowds, anglers standing longer than usual, farmers stopping along bridges, people watching the surface in silence. Then came the fish. In several locations, freshwater fish were seen rising toward the surface in unusual numbers. They were not floating lifeless. They were not thrashing or gasping. Instead, they hovered just beneath the waterline, suspended in stillness, their bodies barely moving, as if waiting. After a time, they slipped back below the surface, leaving no clear explanation behind. For those watching, the scene was unsettling precisely because it lacked spectacle. There was no mass die-off, no emergency response, no visible catastrophe, just a quiet interruption of normal behavior. Rivers that should have flowed unnoticed now seemed to hesitate. The pattern felt connected to what had already unfolded on land. First, the ground separated cleanly. Then birds reversed course under clear skies. After that, the earth sank silently beneath homes. Now, the rivers themselves appeared to pause, different elements responding within the same narrow window of time. All without noise, all without force. In Scripture, water is often the first element to react when hidden conditions change. Long before nations respond, rivers and springs bear witness. The prophet Amos records the Lord saying, "Shall not the land tremble for this, and everyone mourn who dwells in it, and all of it rise like the Nile, and be tossed about, and sink again?" Amos 8-8. The image is not of sudden destruction, but of water lifting what lies beneath into view. The Psalms speak of rivers responding as if aware. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, the floods have lifted up their voice. Psalm 93:3. Water reacts before words are spoken. It reveals before judgment is named. And in Exodus, when the Nile turned and life within it surfaced, the change was not hidden. The fish in the river died, and the river stank. Exodus 7:21. What had sustained life could no longer conceal what it carried. Rivers are meant to move forward. They carry things away. They cleanse. When they begin to hold, to reveal, or to behave unnaturally, it suggests a limit has been reached, a boundary has quietly been crossed. The question, then, is not whether rivers can change. They always have. The deeper question is why these changes are appearing now alongside silent shifts in land and sky. Why is what should flow calmly now drawing attention to itself? And if the water is responding before warnings are spoken, what is it revealing that we are not yet ready to face? As signs continued to unfold across the United States, a quieter and more personal change began to appear, one that many people noticed only while walking past familiar streets and backyards. In parts of the Midwest, the Appalachian foothills, and pockets of the Northeast, clusters of young, healthy trees began shedding their leaves in the middle of the growing season. These were not aging trees or drought-stressed growth. Just days earlier, their canopies had been full and green. Then, almost at once, branches stood bare. There was no prolonged heat wave draining the soil, no visible infestation moving from tree to tree. The leaves did not yellow slowly or decay in stages. They dropped cleanly, often overnight, collecting in quiet piles beneath trunks that were still firm and alive. The trees did not bend or break. They remained upright, rooted, and standing yet suddenly exposed. For those who noticed, the sight was unsettling not because of destruction, but because of restraint. Life had not been taken. It had been uncovered. Neighbors described pausing mid-step, brushing leaves aside with their shoes, looking up to see branches stripped while nearby trees remained untouched. The moment felt deliberate, as if something had been removed while the core was intentionally left intact. In the Old Testament, leaves are often tied to covering protection, blessing, and concealment. In Genesis, when Adam and Eve first became aware of their vulnerability, they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Genesis 3-7. Covering, in Scripture, is linked to mercy. When that covering is removed, it is not always judgment. Often, it is warning exposure before consequence. The prophets speak of this kind of uncovering as a signal. Isaiah writes, "The earth mourns and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth languish." Isaiah 24-4. The image is not annihilation, but life laid bare. Likewise, Jeremiah describes a tree that still stands, but can no longer hide its condition. "I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form, and all its cities were broken down." Jeremiah 4:23-26. What remains standing is no longer concealed. This moment feels distinct from the other signs. The land split. The ground gave way. Rivers revealed what they carried. The sea returned what it held. But here, life itself is preserved. The trees are not destroyed. They are allowed to stand without their covering. The message is quieter, yet more intimate. What makes this event especially striking is its selectivity. Not every tree was affected, not entire forests stripped bare. Instead, small clusters of healthy growth were uncovered, often beside trees that remained untouched. It was not widespread devastation. It was precise exposure. Throughout Scripture, trees represent continuity and endurance. The righteous flourish like the palm tree. Psalm 92-12. They grow slowly. They survive storms. They measure time. When such life is suddenly uncovered without being uprooted, it suggests a pause, a moment suspended between mercy and outcome. The question, then, is not why trees lose leaves. That is part of nature. The deeper question is why this is happening out of season, to healthy life, without clear cause. Why preserve what could be destroyed, yet remove what once protected it? If life can remain standing while its covering is taken away, it suggests a warning rather than an ending, an invitation to recognize vulnerability before strength is tested further. And if exposure comes first, what follows depends not on what is revealed, but on how it responds once seen. After rivers began to behave unnaturally, the warning did not remain inland. It moved outward toward the American coastline, where the sea itself began to change. Along Florida's Gulf Coast, from the Panhandle down through southwest Florida, residents watched as red tide returned with unusual strength and persistence. This was not a short-lived bloom. It settled in. It expanded. And week after week, it refused to retreat. The water darkened into heavy crimson and rust-colored bands, replacing stretches of blue and green that locals were used to seeing year-round. The smell arrived before the sight, thick, sour, unmistakable, traveling miles inland. People closed their windows in the heat. Beach roads emptied. Long familiar shorelines were suddenly avoided. Fish washed ashore in staggering numbers, lining the sand in silence. Dolphins, sea turtles, and seabirds were found gasping near the surface or stranded along the coast, trapped in water that could no longer sustain life. Red tide itself is not new to Florida. It has appeared before and eventually faded. What made this moment different was not its presence, but its endurance. The water did not clear, as expected. What should have been carried away lingered. What the sea once absorbed now returned, visible and unavoidable. In the Old Testament, the sea often represents what is hidden, restrained, and held beyond human control. When Scripture speaks of the waters changing, it is not framed as chaos, but as consequence. In Exodus, the Nile turns, and life within it surfaces. The waters were turned to blood, and the fish in the river died, and the river stank. Exodus 7:20-21. What had sustained life could no longer conceal what it carried. The prophets echo this pattern. Hosea warns of a land where the sea itself responds to accumulated weight. Therefore the land mourns, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Hosea 4-3. The order is deliberate. What is hidden beneath the surface is revealed when limits are crossed. And the psalmist describes the sea not as raging, but as restrained until it can no longer hold. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Psalm 89-9. When restraint gives way, it signals that a boundary has been tested. This moment carries that same quiet weight. The ocean is not storming, it is responding. Not with violence, but with exposure. Boundaries that once seemed permanent are no longer holding. The sea is showing that it has limits, and that those limits have been pressed over time. The question is no longer whether the ocean can change. History shows that it can. The deeper question is what happens when the sea can no longer cleanse itself. If what was once absorbed is now returned, what does that say about what has been carried for too long? And if the water itself is signaling consequence, how close are we to the point where there is nothing left to conceal? In recent weeks, attention has shifted to the waters off the coast of Florida, where something unexpected has begun to happen beneath the surface. Sections of the ocean floor have collapsed, without warning. There were no hurricanes, no powerful waves, and no seismic activity to signal what was coming. On the surface, the sea looked stable. Below it, the foundation gave way. Authorities moved quickly to close portions of the coastline after sand began to disappear, and the seabed fractured beneath shallow waters. In some areas, the change was discovered only after boats reported sudden depth drops and sonar readings revealed voids where solid ground had been. Geologists point to Florida's unique geology as part of the explanation. The state rests on limestone, a material that slowly dissolves as water moves through it. But even experts admit something unsettling. While the process is understood, the timing is not. These failures are difficult to predict. The scale and suddenness do not follow clear patterns. This is where the event takes on deeper meaning. In Scripture, foundations represent trust and security, what everything else depends on. When foundations fail quietly, the danger has already existed long before collapse becomes visible. The psalmist asks pointedly, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Psalm 11-3. The verse does not describe noise or chaos, but the moment when what once supported life can no longer be relied upon. The Old Testament repeatedly portrays the sea as resting on hidden supports known only to God. Job records the Lord asking, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone?" Job 38-4. 6. Foundations are real, but unseen. When they fail, the collapse appears sudden only because the weakening was hidden. Isaiah describes a similar pattern of silent instability. The earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken. Isaiah 24-19. Yet the breaking begins before the shaking. Separation comes first. What looks solid gives way underneath. Even the waters themselves are shown as restrained until their limits are reached. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Psalm 104-9. When boundaries shift, it signals not randomness, but consequence, an order that is no longer holding. That is what makes the situation off Florida's coast so troubling. The question is not why the ground can collapse. Nature has always done that. The deeper question is why it is collapsing now silently, beneath calm waters, while the surface still appears stable. When the foundation gives way without sound, it signals that something essential has already weakened. And if what lies beneath can fail without warning, then what appears secure above it may be resting on far less than anyone realized. This is only the beginning. What begins as a single collapse beneath the sea rarely remains isolated. Along Florida's coastline, scientists have observed that when one section of the seabed gives way, the surrounding area often becomes unstable. The failure of one hidden cavity shifts pressure outward, weakening nearby sections that may already be close to collapse. Geologists describe this as a chain reaction. One void fails. The surrounding sediment adjusts. Stress redistributes. What had been holding sometimes for decades suddenly loses balance. New sinkholes can form not because something new was added, but because support that once existed is no longer there. This is what unsettles many coastal residents. The concern is no longer about a single underwater collapse, but about spread. Communities fear that what began offshore may continue along the coastline, quietly undermining areas that appear unchanged on the surface. The land may still look solid. The water may remain calm, but beneath it, the system is no longer stable. Scripture often describes collapse in the same way, not as a lone event, but as something that multiplies once it begins. The Bible teaches that a small, hidden failure rarely stays contained. What is compromised in one place gradually affects the whole. Breakdown spreads not through noise, but through influence. In the last days, Scripture does not describe one dramatic moment that ends everything at once. Instead, it speaks of a sequence signs unfolding together, one leading into another. The warning is not found in a single collapse, but in the pattern that follows it. That is what makes these sinkholes so significant. They are not standing alone. They are revealing how interconnected everything beneath the surface truly is. If one unseen failure can destabilize an entire system, then the question becomes unavoidable. How many other weaknesses already exist beneath the world we assume is secure? As the seabed fractured and hidden caverns collapsed, something else began to surface, dark, sticky material long buried beneath layers of sand and stone. Along portions of the coast, tar-like substances appeared in the water and washed ashore in small but noticeable amounts. They did not arrive suddenly in one mass. They emerged gradually, as if released from a place that had been sealed for a very long time. Scientists believe these tar balls are not new pollutants, but ancient organic matter remnants of biological material trapped deep beneath the seabed centuries ago. Over time, pressure and sediment sealed them away, keeping them undisturbed. When the foundation below fractured, those sealed layers were breached. What had remained hidden was no longer contained. The timing matters. These substances did not rise during storms or heavy wave action. They appeared after collapse, after the structure holding them in place failed. The earth did not create something new, it released what was already there. Scripture often uses burial as a symbol. Things hidden deep represent what is unseen, unresolved, or decaying beneath the surface. In the Gospel, it is written, "Nothing is hidden that will not be revealed." The meaning is not only moral, but structural. What is buried does not stay buried forever. It remains concealed only as long as the foundation above it holds. This is why the emergence of these dark substances feels significant. When the foundation breaks, what comes out first is rarely clean. It is what has been sealed away, the residue of what was never meant to be exposed. If the earth itself begins to release what it has hidden for centuries, it raises a sobering question. What else lies beneath the surface, contained not by strength, but by fragile support, and what may be revealed next, as those foundations continue to give way? Thank you for watching.
Fascinated by the phenomenon, he recorded a video as a memory and asked a local about it. White ring high above the clouds.
Oh, blessed Jesus, look at that. How many?
Have you noticed how strange events are happening almost at the same time? Across the United States, with no rain and no alert, thick, muddy water violently erupted from the ground, ripping through streets as people ran in panic. At the very same time, the sky demanded attention. A flawless blue ring appeared overhead, perfectly formed, suspended as if time itself paused. Then a cloud emerged, shaped unmistakably like a human figure, arms stretched wide, glowing quietly in the sunlight. Moments later, fire tore through the sky, a blazing object, igniting, fragmenting, then vanishing without a trace. These weren't isolated events. They happened together below our feet and above our heads. Coincidence, or a signal we were meant to notice? If something feels off, hit like and stay with me. Just moments ago, residents in Reading witnessed something no one expects to see in an ordinary American city. There was no storm warning, no heavy rain pounding the streets. No build-up. And then, without notice, the ground itself erupted. From intact pavement, thick, muddy water burst upward with force, shooting into the air like columns driven from beneath the earth. This was not water flowing downhill. It was not runoff. It rose violently, as if pressure had been building unseen, waiting for the exact moment to break through. The water was dark and heavy, saturated with sediment. It carried the color and weight of something pulled from deep underground layers, not from surface drains. Witnesses described the shock of watching normal city roads transform into unstable ground in seconds. Cars were pushed off course. Streets became impassable. People could be heard retreating, shouting warnings, stepping back as if the earth itself had become unsafe to stand on. This was not a slow failure. It was sudden, aggressive, disruptive. The kind of event that leaves people silent afterward, struggling to understand what they just saw. Officials moved quickly to calm the situation. Explanations followed: aging infrastructure, ruptured pipes, underground pressure, familiar words, logical terms. Yet even as explanations circulated, unease remained. Because infrastructure failures do not usually behave like eruptions. They leak, they crack, they sink. What happened here forced water upward, violently, as though something below had been released all at once. That distinction matters. In Scripture, when catastrophic water events are described, the focus is not only on rain from above. In the account of Noah's flood, Genesis records something far more unsettling. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. Judgment did not begin solely with clouds opening. It began with the earth itself failing from below. That detail is often overlooked, but it changes the picture entirely. Water rising from beneath speaks of instability, where people assume permanence. Roads are built on the belief that the ground will hold. Cities expand on the assumption that what lies below is solid, predictable, and controlled. When that assumption fails, it shakes more than infrastructure. It shakes confidence. The events in Reading force an uncomfortable question into the open. If water can suddenly surge upward from unseen depths, what else lies beneath our systems, our cities, our sense of security? And how much pressure is building out of sight? This was not rain overwhelming drains. This was the ground asserting itself without warning. Scripture consistently uses the earth's behavior as a sign not to provoke panic, but to provoke awareness. When foundations tremble or break open, the message is not merely physical, it is symbolic. It reminds people that stability is not guaranteed simply because yesterday felt normal. When water rises from below instead of falling from above, it signals that something foundational has shifted. And once foundations begin to move, events rarely remain isolated. While the ground was violently breaking open below, the story did not remain confined to the streets. Almost at the same time, attention was drawn upward, far above the chaos unfolding on the Earth's surface. As if the disturbance below was being mirrored above, something unusual appeared in the sky that demanded explanation. Passengers aboard a commercial flight captured footage of a perfectly defined blue circle suspended among the clouds. It was not faint. It was not distorted. It was sharply outlined, vivid in color, and unmistakably circular. Against the shifting white and gray of surrounding cloud layers, this formation stood apart, unnaturally precise, visually isolated, and impossible to ignore. Unlike ordinary cloud patterns, the blue circle did not drift with the wind. It did not stretch, thin out, or dissolve as clouds normally do. It remained still, fixed, held in place, as if anchored. While nearby clouds shifted and flowed, this formation maintained its structure, giving the unsettling impression of something intentional rather than atmospheric. Observers struggled to describe what they were seeing. Many said it resembled an opening like a doorway or gate suspended in the heavens. Others compared it to a lens or aperture, as though the sky itself had been punctured for a brief moment. What unsettled viewers most was not its color or shape, but its behavior. The sky was moving. The circle was not. That contrast matters.